Good evening, good afternoon from Zurich or wherever we are here on this hybrid call today. My name is Martin Sonneveld. I'm the Executive Director of the World Food Systems Center, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this fifth lecture in the series on agroecology and the transition to sustainable food systems, which was a series of 5 interventions on 5 different principles of agroecology. And it's a great pleasure to welcome William Thompson and Fergus Sinclair as our speakers tonight. But before I will give them the floor, please allow me to share a few things. And those who have joined us earlier, they know that what is now coming. But for those who are new, it's maybe nice to have a very brief introduction in sustainable food systems and agroecology. So for us, sustainable food systems are key because they connect to all the sustainable development goal of the Agenda 2030 through different elements, through different also dimensions, from environment to social dimension, economic dimension, but also the interactions between human being and producers. Agroecology for food systems transformation, the definition of agroecology is threefold. It's a science, it's a set of practices on the ground, and it's also a social movement. And that's very important to understand these 3 different dimensions of agroecology and the interlinkages then also with consumers and producers, and the whole also societal dimensions which come with the understanding of agroecology. Here, the definition, you have seen this already much earlier in the other interventions, and the agroecology approaches favor the use of natural processes, promote closed cycles with minimal negative externalities, and stress the importance of local knowledge and participatory processes that develop knowledge further, that develop practice through experience, and that also connect to science. And agroecology approaches recognize that agri-food systems are coupled social and ecological systems from production to consumption. It involves science, practice, and as I said, social movement. And through this holistic understanding, the interactions and the integration is very important and is key to address then also food and nutrition security aspects, which are not only production linked, but have a lot of different dimensions too. Here, the 13 principles on the spot, and as I already introduced it earlier, we have principles which address more the agroecosystems, and we have principles which do directly connect to the food systems in a much larger and more holistic understanding. And that also links a bit to the way how then transformation of food systems can be triggered by agroecological practices and agroecology as a concept. So we have more incremental changes, increase efficiency, or the substitute of conventional inputs with other types of agroecological alternatives. But we have also transformative elements and levels where questions of the redesign of agroecosystems or an entire global new food systems are addressed, which then also lead to a more just, fair, and participatory food system as such. As I said, we had 5 different lectures. We started with biodiversity, talked about animal health in agroecology. We discussed social values and the importance of it in food systems. Last week, there was an input on participation. And today we talk about land and natural resource use governance. So how to to govern the use of land and natural resources. And we are excited that next spring semester we will be again able to organize this kind of hybrid event between student lecture at one hand and public lecture on the other. After this few words from my side, I will definitely hand over and very happily hand over the micro to Will and Fergus for their inputs. And at the end, after the two inputs, we collect questions. Please use the opportunity to raise questions in the Q&A function, and we will then transfer them to the speakers for the discussion before we then close the public part, and Fergus and Will are then still able to share some time with the students in the lecture hall back in Zurich. Yes, Will and Fergus, they will introduce themselves. They will share their work, their experiences, examples from their work with us later. And before I hand over the word to them, please allow me just 10 seconds of advertisement for an event upcoming on November 11th. So if you like the work we do, or if you're interested in food system research, much more general, then and it happens you're in Zurich, then you're more than welcome to join us on the food day. You'll find more information on the website too. So hopefully we stay somehow connected through this series next spring or through other activities and events we organize. With that sense, I don't want to make it much longer, and I'm happily passing over the word to Will. Will, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Can you see my slides now?
We can see the slides and we can hear you well.
Fantastic. I start the presentation. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Martin. It's really nice to be talking to this event through the World Food Systems Centre. My name's Will Thompson. I'm a research fellow and knowledge exchange fellow at the University of Oxford in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. And I conducted my PhD, which is some of the research I'll be talking about today, at the Sustainable Agroecosystems Lab at ETH Zurich, supported by the World Food Systems Centre. So it's great to come back. And I was asked by the team at the World Food Systems Centre what makes land and natural resource governance important for agroecology, and how does my work connect to this? So I will try and sort of join the dots to a particular project looking at private sustainability governance, and how does this interact with the other principles of agroecology? What challenges do we face in supporting this resource governance or gaining wider adoption of agroecology, and what role can science, policy or practice play in overcoming these challenges? So you'll just seen this set of principles from the high-level panel of experts. I will be focusing on land and natural resource governance and try and connect it to some other aspects such as economic diversification, biodiversity, soil health and input reduction linked through the system that I studied in West Africa, cocoa agroforestry. So broadly, what is environmental governance and how does it relate to agroecological transitions? From the Earth System Governance Project, the interrelated environmental governance is the interrelated and increasingly integrated system of formal and informal rules, rule-making systems, actor networks at all levels of human society, from local to global, that are set up to steer societies towards preventing, mitigating, and adapting to global and local environmental change, and in particular, Earth system transformation. And this can be seen within a normative context of sustainable development, and in the case of this lecture, looking at the normative context of agroecological transitions. So how is relevant for agroecological transitions? Well, from the FAO, agroecology calls for responsible and effective governance to support the transition to sustainable food and agricultural systems. Transparent, accountable, and inclusive governance mechanisms are necessary to create an enabling environment that supports producers to transform their systems following these agroecological concepts and practices. So, broadly looking at different types of governance, so governance for agroecological transitions, but also of the transitions themselves. We can split it into the three main categories. We can look at command and control, so public policy, often delivered by governments in general, and this is using incentives, regulations, and information steering towards politically defined objectives. There are problems with this, including legitimacy and also the effectiveness of this system. We can move along a spectrum and look at public-private governance, where we're leveraging the dynamics of business and society. This takes advantage of research and technology and innovation, but also market regulation policies, as well as partnerships, networks, and broader discourse. This is often involving government and business, but not limited to that, also civil society as well. Problems can include the design of incentives, accountability of these systems, and therefore also their effectiveness. Beyond this, we can look at adaptive governance, so a more responsive form of governance responding to emergent properties of complex transition processes, with an emphasis on visioning, experimental approaches, so learning by doing, and monitoring and evaluating, so we can use reflexivity, we can respond and adapt appropriate interventions during windows of opportunity. And this is carried out by a whole spectrum of institutions at different scales. Problems can include coordination and also the need for real-time assessment, which can be challenging in different contexts. So yeah, today I will focus on, in particular, a private form of governance, but we must acknowledge that lots of these different forms of governance interact in many different ways. I will be looking at voluntary sustainability standards, particularly in global food value chains, so commodities that are produced often in the global south, traded and processed and consumed in general in the global north. When we're looking at these voluntary sustainability standards, this is defined by the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards as requirements that producers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, or service providers may be asked to meet relating to a range of sustainability metrics, including respect for basic human rights, worker health and safety, the environment, impacts on production, community relations, land use planning, and others. So examples being sustainability certification, roundtables such as the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, moratoriums against production or purchasing in certain areas, public-private partnerships, and also things such as pre-competitive landscape interventions. So I will really focus today on NGO-led certifications, and there'll be some that you'll be familiar with, such as Rainforest Alliance, OOTS, organic. They're similarly also called eco-labels, sustainability certification, private sustainability standards, and as mentioned, voluntary sustainability standards. I want to look at a particular case study where we're connecting the use of these private forms of governance into ways of enhancing the sustainability of a particular supply chain. So we're looking at the Ghanaian cocoa value chain. Ghana is a globally significant producer of cocoa, contributing over 20% of the world's cocoa to the global chocolate industry. And this is essentially exclusively smallholder production. And in Ghana, there is a medium to low coverage of these sustainability initiatives. It's relatively low, but it's still higher than other jurisdictions in the region. And interestingly, the marketing of this product is state controlled. Cocoa production, so cocoa is a tree crop and it's climate sensitive. In particular, maximum temperatures during dry season can inhibit yield and production, cause tree mortality, and reduce yields. And in West Africa, we can see this is a figure from SIAP, from Schroth et al., 2016. They're looking at a change in suitability predicted due to change in climate. And this is often driven, like I say, by the maximum temperature in the dry season, reducing areas that are suitable for climate production. So there is a climate threat to this value chain, and I want to look into just this type of governance as a way of mitigating this climate threat, and the process in which this can be achieved is through the adoption of more agroecological practices. So this is where the connection is made in this case study. Very quickly, just to highlight smallholder farming for those of you that are less familiar with it. In general, smallholders are farming on less than 1 hectare of land. Housing and sanitation can be poor, but they produce 60 to 80% of the world's food. They're, at least in general, twice as productive as much larger farms. However, this is because they're working 3 times as much on a given area. And so they have, in general, low access to innovation and credit, and low productive capital. But they produce, in general, lots of food, but not all of this is marketed, with the exception of commodity crops in the case of cocoa here. There's off-farm work to support incomes, but often wages are low. And globally, over 40% of smallholders are poor, and they spend more than half of their income to buy produce, to produce food, to consume food. So, and just in the context of the cocoa value chain that we'll be exploring here, through globalization, it's led to increased participation of these smallholder farmers in this global system of trade. And so this is where food is produced, processed, distributed and retailed across international borders. So, as mentioned before, often produced in the global south, processed and value added in the global north, with lots of the profits remaining there. It's increasingly acknowledged that the upstream actors, so we're talking about retailers and traders in such a value chain, must source more responsibly, given the threats faced to smallholder farmers, particularly in the context of cocoa. Here we talk about climate resilience as an example of where these upstream actors need to be more responsible in their sourcing to support these value chains. So in terms of cocoa production, the agroecosystems that they're produced in West Africa, it ranges, it's in general smallholder farms, but there are some much larger scale plantations. There has been a trend to produce full sun cocoa. This means cocoa that is produced in a monoculture of just cocoa trees. Traditionally, it was cocoa was produced in more shaded agroforests, and more recently, there's been an acknowledgement that actually, given the climate adaptive benefits and also the income diversification benefits, in line with almost all of the agroecological principles that were highlighted at the start of the lecture, diverse agroforestry could be an attractive option with the clear benefits across biodiversity, climate adaptation, and for livelihoods in general. And so this is an opportunity in West Africa, given that, and through some of our own research in the Agroecosystem Lab, we looked at some of the farms in our broader study using some satellite images, and we're seeing that shade cover in these farms is around 5%. So 5% of the land area of the farm is covered by non-cocoa multifunctional shade trees, and these farms have the capacity to potentially increase this up to levels of 30 or 40% with actually not losing any cocoa yield because of the climate adaptive benefits of these systems. So there's a potential for an agroecological transition in West Africa, in terms of how that will happen, who decides that will happen, and how that will be governed. These are all open questions, but one mechanism that's been posited so I'm just getting some feedback, I think. Excuse me. But yeah, one mechanism that has been posited is sustainability certification. So I will look at the effect of Boots, Rainforest Alliance, and organic. And I will look at how this affects the climate resilience of smallholder farmers, but also in terms of the diversification and adoption of agroforestry. We'll look in particular at one climate shock that occurred in 2015, 2016. This is a drought driven by the El Nino climate effect, and this lasted just over 12 months. You can see the diagram on the bottom left. This is the drought severity index, essentially water balance, and it was severely dry. So below this intermediate line at 0, where for several months there were drought conditions for many of the cocoa farmers. So the study we conducted, we conceptualized a resilience framework building on work by Tender et al. At TTH, and we used a stakeholder co-generation process, so a overall transdisciplinary research process, where building on a previous project at ECH, we established a value chain platform with multiple actors, including traders, certifiers, farmers, the local government, national government, COCOBOD, the state governing institution for cocoa in Ghana, and we co-defined what climate resilience really meant for the farmers in particular, and also these broader value chain actors. This was validated through focus groups and semi-structured interviews. And then we used this framework that we'd co-designed with the farmers to assess the impact of these sustainability certifications that I mentioned before. To do this, we collected socioeconomic data, biophysical data on farm, and used remote sensing data as well. To analyze this, we looked at tree cover and diversity, as well as soil analysis. And more broadly, we used a form of counterfactual analysis to understand, in a quasi-experimental process. We haven't randomly assigned these different certifications. We are just observing, but we are using a matching process to understand the impact of these certifications. And then beyond this, we took these results back to stakeholders to validate. So this is the smallholder climate resilience framework that we co-generated with the farmers. We look at 4 sequential processes. So we're looking at preparation, a stage before a shock, such as a drought occurs, response, actions that occur during that shock, acknowledging that impacts will be felt at this point, and recovery will then subsequently occur. Beyond this, we look at the learning effect, so whether farmers following this the impacts and the recovery process, if they can incrementally adapt or even more radically transform their system. And all these indicators were identified by these farmers and broader value chain stakeholders. Just to highlight that the climate resilience was included in the sustainability certifications that we were working with across many of these indicators. Some of them were mandatory, some of them were recommended, and some of them were mandatory at group level. So we performed this analysis in 2 regions of Ghana, so in the western region and in the eastern, across around 500 cocoa farms. And what did we find? So we actually found that cocoa sustainability certification underperformed for enhancing climate resilience, particularly on these more complex resilience measures versus the agricultural practices. So farmers that were certified were more likely to use mineral fertilizer, to use liquid fertilizer, and adopt specific types of organic fertilizer, but they were not more likely to adopt resilience measures such as water harvesting, enhancing shade cover on farm, or building fire belts, leaving an area around the farm to reduce the spread of fire. Beyond this, in terms of diversification strategies, farmers were not more likely in general, as a result of the certification, to diversify their farming practices and also the shade cover on their farms. And this is reflected in our conclusions. In terms of how this affected yields as one aspect in terms of heavily linked to income, as farmers were often around 80% dependent on cocoa as a source of income on the farms. We found that compared to a normal production year where there was no drought experience, if we compared the loss of yields on certified farms to the loss of yields on non-certified farms, we found that certification did not modify the impact of the drought, and actually the regional effects in terms of climate were much more stark in terms of the response of yields. There were some benefits related to resilience, more broadly looking at adaptability and transformability, and this is related to group membership and training, so giving openings of potential opportunities for farmers to learn, but these were indirect benefits. So in terms of more broad conclusions regarding sustainability certification, resilience, and the potential for agroecological transition through these governance mechanisms, we found sustainability certification in its current form is not a sufficient tool for improving the climate resilience of smallholders. Specifically, existing certifications suffer from major gaps between their ambition, so what was proposed in their standards, and implementation on the ground. We did, however, find indirect benefits to climate resilience through the support of group formation and strengthening good agronomic practice. What we see in terms of these factors that would enhance resilience and also constitute part of a broader transformation or transition to agroecology in terms of diversifying the agroforests, adopting agroforestry in general, moving from monoculture to highly diverse agroforests. There's a risk that these types of governance mechanisms, because they focus on one single commodity, and this really stands at odds with the potential benefits of agroecology more broadly, particularly with diversification and multifunctional farming. We find in general that if to enhance the effectiveness of these mechanisms, that they need to accommodate the subnational regional contexts that were incredibly stark. And the same approach would not be valid from the eastern region to the western region. Finally, just to a quick sort of look forward beyond these mechanisms, focusing on the single commodity, the future studies that this sort of work is leading to at the moment. For the Sustained Cocoa Project, we're looking at different types of interventions, so ones that are not purely commodity focused, but look at enhancing tenure. So in Ghana, farmers are not legal owners of the trees on their farms currently, but there is a series of projects that are looking to register trees in anticipation that it actually becomes a change in constitution occurs and farmers can own this. And so we want to look at the impact of this in terms of diversifying agroforests. We're also looking at the impact of land titling programs and also more broadly at payment for ecosystem services and in respect to adopting agroforestry. Beyond that, as part of the HARP Toolkit project, we're working on a better integration of farmer knowledge with ecological knowledge. So these sustainability certifications are often designed top down. It means farmers don't have a large say in the way that they're designed. And we're looking at mechanisms that actually the knowledge that farmers have can be incorporated with this scientific ecological knowledge to inform more locally adapted interventions. And more broadly at a landscape scale, this is something we're interested in evaluating as well in terms of any pre-competitive collaborations that are occurring more broadly than just these farm scale interventions or cooperative scale interventions that the sustainability certification works at. And with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much to all of my collaborators, master students, and the stakeholders that are involved in the research. Thank you for listening. I'll hand over to Fergus.
Thank you, Will, and what a stimulating start. So let me try and share my screen. Are you seeing something, folks?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to sort of start from a really broad standpoint, because you know, we've just seen a really detailed analysis of the cocoa sector, I want to start really broad and look at what the real governance challenge is for agroecology and how it is responding to it. I want to say something about how the current food crisis actually makes this more important rather than less, which is a dominant narrative. And then concentrate a little bit on the missing middle, because I think there's a key implementation gap at a local landscape scale that we really need to address. And then say something about systems change, because it's a transformation of a food system, which is what agroecology is about, really requires governance across a whole range of scales. And then we'll say something about gender transformative actions, and then look at different areas of governance. So what I want to be clear about is that there are these interacting global challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, broken food systems, really widespread land and water degradation. And these are very unequally distributed around the world. And of course, those who are causing climate change are not necessarily those who are receiving its impacts. And in relation to food security, as we've known for decades, it's not just the production of food that results in hunger, but actually whether people can access it or not. Now, the fact that these challenges are interacting is what makes governance so difficult. And there's a lot of evidence now coming on stream to show that it is the interaction between different challenges that make the difference. So if we just take insect diversity and abundance as an example, recent paper by Charlie Outhwaite in Nature that shows it's the interaction between climate change and agricultural intensification that's resulting in a 50% lower abundance of insects and 27% fewer species. And this is more prevalent in tropical than temperate cases. In some temperate cases, climate change actually improves the diversity issue. So the critical issue is it's the synergy, the interaction that is important. And that means that we should be, in a governance context, not just looking at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, individually, but trying to understand their interactions. So if we, in this example, look at the prevalence of undernourishment, a sort of hunger metric, in relation to land degradation, then we can see that some countries are achieving better nutrition at the expense of land degradation. In other cases, they're able to get a win-win, and that's obviously where we want to be. And if we generalize this in terms of a governance context, then as Kate Raworth has shown in her Donut Economics, we have these two competing dimensions of, on the one hand, at the center of her donut is meeting the well-being needs of people. These are the social and the economic well-being of people. But we need to do that without exceeding planetary boundaries. And if we look at how countries fare, if we look at the extent to which they're achieving the well-being thresholds and the extent to which they're transgressing planetary boundaries, then we can see that all countries are developing because they're not getting the management of these competing factors right. And if we look at the sweet spot of where we should be, which is where we're meeting well-being needs without transgressing planetary boundaries. There are no countries that are actually there. Now, we've seen variations of this diagram from both the previous speakers. And as Will pointed out, land and natural resource governance is a sort of critical factor in terms of the 13 HLPE principles. And it interacts with all of the other principles in quite an important way. And as you can imagine, governance ends up being critical for realizing at a much more ground roots level what farmers can actually do or they can't. So in the report for the Global Commission on Adaptation, in looking at what is constraining widespread adoption of agroecology, there were three key elements that came out. The need to create a level playing field so that agroecology can be judged in a fair way in relation to alternatives. The need to embrace complexity, and the need to enable integration both horizontally across sectors and vertically in relation to scales. And just to unpack this a little bit, in terms of creating a level playing field, it's quite clear that there are market failures. So the private sector by itself does not deliver environmentally sustainable outcomes, because we value some things, commodities, for example, but we don't necessarily require people to pay for polluting things or value long-term slow variables like soil health. We've also got lots of maladapted policies, as Will was talking about in relation to whether trees on farms are owned by farmers, make a big impact on whether they're prepared to have trees on their farms. And of course, the evidence base. And there's been a huge investment in knowledge about monoculture agriculture forced by chemicals, much less research on agroecological alternatives. And complexity is a big issue, and it's something we'll keep looking at as we move on. Now, the current food crisis is leading to some interesting narratives, and one of them is that, oh, we've got a problem in terms of food prices going up, fertilizer prices going up. Now is not the time to go into agroecology. What we need to be doing is concentrating on production, subsidizing things and so on in order to make it happen. But actually, if we look at the increasing evidence that there is, there's a very solid basis now. There's a paper in Nature Sustainability by Chloe McLaren and her co-authors recently, which was a really big analysis of 30 long-term trials, each of which had at least 9 years of data, more than 25,000 data points. And it basically showed that by integrating a higher level of crop diversity with legumes, you can substitute for inorganic nitrogen fertilizer. And this really shows us that governance and technology issues are not separate things. They're obviously very connected, because it's policymakers who make decisions about which technologies are being favored or disfavored by the way in which regulation operates. And it's quite interesting that if we start thinking about what is the more sensible option for providing nitrogen to our crops, is it an industrial production of nitrogen at high temperatures and pressures using fossil fuels, high greenhouse gas emissions, creating a sort of cost and risk to farmers, requirement for distribution. And of course, where governments subsidize this, then they also take those risks. And we end up with something which is non-resilient at farm and often national levels, with high losses, leakage and pollutions. But, and very importantly, it's a very simple thing to do. You take your bag, and it's almost like being addicted to drugs. You put a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer on your crop and you get a fairly immediate response. The fact that you might lose a lot of it through leaching is another issue. Whereas if we look at biological nitrogen fixation, where our factory is actually a plant with a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium or frankia or other microbes, we have a distributed ownership by millions of smallholder farmers. So we're changing the whole governance of the nitrogen fixation process. This is obviously more resilient at farm and national levels. There's less leakage and pollution, but it's complex and it's knowledge intensive, because from farm to farm, you need different species, there are different soil types, different requirements for what will work. So it requires a whole system change and a support for local innovation. So this brings us on to this concept of scales. And I think the issues about governance are important in two ways. One, we have private sector governance, value chain upgrading, certification, as we just saw from Will's intervention, and impact investment, where people are trying to put financial investment where it's going to make a positive impact on the environment, on equity and social aspects. But then we have on the other side, the public sector governance, the standard legislation, taxes, incentives, regulations, and the policies and institutions that influence what happens. And we have civil society then in between these things and interacting. And this operates at different scales, at the level of the field, the farm, the landscape, and the whole food system. And obviously, different policies, different private sector interventions are acting at each of these levels. Now, it's very clear that there is a very serious implementation gap, which we can label a missing middle. And this is really quite stark, because in many contexts, there are very strong international and national commitments to land restoration, biodiversity conservation, food and nutrition security. And these happen, interestingly, at an international level through different conventions. The Convention on Biodiversity, UNFCCC in relation to climate, UNCCD on biodiversity, and the Committee on World Food Security for the food system. But translating what are often really quite solid commitments at national level down through subnational elements to fields, farms, and forests is problematic. And that's because we're really missing both the social capital or policy instruments at local landscape scale to make things happen. So in the words of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, well, changing them a little bit, commitments everywhere, nor any land restored. And if we look at the actual realization, for example, of the AFR 100 land restoration commitments in Africa, we can see this disconnect between, on the one hand, the commitment, on the other hand, what actually happens on the ground, because of a lack of intersectoral integration as we move to lower scales, and the issue that as we get to the more local scales, the integration becomes more important. Now, many of you may know about Andhra Pradesh and the big natural farming movement that's operating statewide. About 10% of the farmers in Andhra Pradesh already taking on an agroecological transition. And there's no yield penalty to them doing this. So the fact that they move from using a large sort of amount of inputs to a more sustainable system it's extremely important that they don't get a yield penalty. It seems to be more significant in the drier areas, probably because of the mulching and moisture conservation. But if we look at what do you need to sustain a natural farming transition in Andhra Pradesh, immediately we come up with some key governance issues. What is the issues that constrain widespread adoption of agroecology are that the formal research, extension, and education systems are supporting a high input agriculture, that policies do the same, and that markets do the same. And so we're not going to get very far unless we make integrated mainstream changes in the whole system. And if we turn that into the positive side of what would we see in the future in order to promote agroecological transition, then obviously it's changing those institutions, policies, and markets so they're operating in a different way. And a critical issue here relates to gender. So in the Andhra Pradesh example, we were looking at self-help groups and the agency of women farmers in really promulgating transitions. And this is the same in many parts of Africa, in Burkina Faso and northern Ghana. The WAFI and Regreening Africa projects showed that by challenging norms around gender in relation to the extent to which women could make decisions about which trees were retained in natural regeneration, and how their time was spent and their involvement in decision making in families, resulted in quite different regreening outcomes. Now, governance of land resources is really important, and soil health. This is erosion prevalence across northwest Vietnam, and you can see in a particular individual site quite aggressive erosion because people are planting maize on really sloping land in order to basically sell maize for pig farming in China, which creates a lot of foreign exchange income for Vietnam. And here we're talking about the paternoster principle, because by looking at what works where and for whom, by participatory work with farmers working bottom up, we can see what is feasible. Oops, I'm wanting now to see whether we can get this. But just working on individual farms didn't make much of a difference in Vietnam. Once you started getting entire landscapes where a proportion of farmers were changing what they did, and in this case putting grasses and trees on contours, having a multi-layered approach to production with tree crops as well as the maize, you got a much more sustainable function. Once policymakers could see at a landscape scale that things were changing, then you got a major change. Now, land and soil health is one thing. Land tenure, people's access, ownership of land is obviously critical in terms of sustainable investment. And in Peru, there's a really exciting concessions program where people are being given rights to use land, providing that they do so sustainably. And of course, another key governance issue is about the genetic resources that farmers use. And there's been a lot of controversy about genetic modification. But the issue there is not the technology of genetic modification, it's what it does to the ability of different people to control and to be able to use resources. And so increasingly empowering farmers to be able to control and develop the use of varieties, seeds that suit them. And that's not necessarily the same. In an agroecological context, the breeding that has been done for monoculture doesn't necessarily result in plants that are suitable for integration. And that brings us to the control and the governance of knowledge, which is absolutely critical. Agroecology implies co-creation of knowledge, and it implies sharing of knowledge in an equitable way. And citizen science is perhaps a critical development that's happening now in relation to making the most of revolutions in information and communications technology. But of course, there's a huge danger that digital approaches can disempower farmers. So governance of knowledge becomes absolutely critical to make it something that's empowering rather than disempowering. So there are critical policy implementation gaps that need to be plugged. And to do that, we need to use this paternoster principle of working bottom up and top down at the same time. We need to understand layers of governance and integrate policy across sectors, environment, agriculture, trade, and so on, across scales, from national, subnational, down to the local landscape scales at which ecosystem services are first manifest and can be managed, and of course across the public and private sectors. And I think we can be really clear that a key missing link is policy instruments and social capital at local landscape scales at which the real the tire hits the tarmac in terms of making a difference to management of farms and landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will and Fergus, for those presentations and the knowledge and experience shared and the examples you provided. Thank you very much. There are two questions in the Q&A. I would like to start with one on payments for ecosystem services, Will. Are there specific ideas how to set up these payments for ecosystem services? That's the question. And maybe I allow myself to connect it to these different principles you had on environmental governance, kind of the command and control or the public-private governance or the adaptive governance. Are payments for ecosystem services only command and control, or are there other possibilities too?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm currently collaborating, not leading research, but collaborating also in West Africa, looking at payment for ecosystem services in the cocoa sector. And one of the approaches that has been taken in this project is co-designing. So really, and this is like largely encouraged broadly across many different sectors, but co-designing a payment for ecosystem services intervention with farmers, but not focusing exclusively on the payment, also looking at the social and cultural norms that are connected to the response that is hoping to be initiated by the intervention. So if we're looking at the adoption of agroforestry, diversification of trees on farm and enhancing shade cover, how can there be some collective ownership in the cooperatives? So this particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, where there's a strong cooperative system. How can we use these sort of like collective ownership of the landscape in terms of how it's perceived at a village level to enhance adoption? And so one thing that's been explored and it's experimental in terms of, it's not something that's prescribed, it's looking at using competition between different cooperatives. So this concept of yardstick competition. Example, for example, this was used in the Dutch healthcare sector, where they have funds to hospitals, but hospitals receive more funding if they perform better on certain metrics, not absolutely, but relative to their previous performance. So we're looking at this in terms of agroforestry adoption, not an absolute metric of how many shade trees have been planted or which species, for example, but relative to what was there in the different landscapes of these cooperatives, and having a leaderboard and showing different relative performance, having different prizes for this. I'm not saying this is necessarily the best way forward. It's more just to say that there is experimentation going on in the field, and more broadly looking at different types of governance that we highlighted earlier. Some research that's come out in Latin America, so looking in the soy context, that I was reading recently, is saying that often, unless it's connected to more jurisdictional approaches, these payment for ecosystem services interventions lead to elite capture. So it's the wealthy farmers that are better connected, that are more able to access these systems, and it may lead to greater inequalities in those landscapes. And so unless this is there's a more effective way of reaching a wide variety of farmers in a landscape, this might exacerbate problems rather than solve them. So yeah, that was a quick run through of my opinions on that.
Can I just come in there?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we need to be a little bit careful here about commodification of ecosystem services, because it's actually really very difficult to actually pay for an ecosystem service, because it's really difficult to attribute the amount of ecosystem service provision that individuals might make, for example. So what we tend to have is more a sort of reward system, that we set up proxies in which we're looking at what behavior in a landscape do we think is better in relation to the provision of ecosystem service, and then you reward land users for adopting the practices which are considered to be better for the landscape. But that, and this is where I was saying, this missing middle is really critical, because this requires a negotiation for any particular landscape in relation to what are the important ecosystem services, and whereabouts in the landscape is it most important to make different interventions. So it's not the case that for every farm in a landscape, the impact of tree planting or whatever it might be that is going to improve the ecosystem services will have the same impact. So if we're looking at, for example, water quality that's coming from a landscape, there will be some places in that landscape that are much more sensitive to that ecosystem service than others. So this is where we really need a nuanced ability to implement policy at this local landscape scale. And I think without that, it's very, very difficult to achieve the requirements. But we then need to set up policy instruments and social capital at those scales in order to make that negotiation possible.
So what you're saying is that we change the resolution of the policies in terms of not national policies, but we tend to have landscape policies, because landscapes are probably those entities which are then similar in terms of their agroecological performance.
Well, yes, it's a question of what you need in order to manage something. And I think it's quite interesting that, you know, the whole sort of literature on ecosystem services, there's, you know, journals and, you know, a huge number of articles about it, but they're operating at a resolution that is not appropriate for the actual management of those ecosystem services at a practical level. And this is a real disjunction between the practical needs of managing something in the real world and the sort of academic interest in you know, looking at things. And it's a real conundrum for policymakers, because policymakers want to make policy at a large scale, you know, I mean, but you can still do that. You can still have broad, you know, national policy objectives and so on, or even regional policy objectives. But when it comes down to implementing them in terms of the actions that you take at a farm or a landscape scale, that's what we don't have. And without it, we're not going to get the results that we're expecting. So that missing middle is critical, I think.
Missing middle or missing link is an example for the second question. It's twofold. It starts that with the assumption or the observation that acting on food system change is key. And then the question is it still the case that farmers may not adapt because they need short-term returns? And agroecology requires longer waiting periods to bring fruits. And if that will be the case, if that's right, how do we manage to support farmers while they wait for agroecological practices or agroecological farms to bring the farm to a speed and provide them the full benefit? Is it a time lag? Is the time lag the missing link, or are there other elements you see are the kind of the hurdles?
No, I think, no, it's a great question. Nicola, really getting to the nub of a critical issue, because essentially, for example, if you look at the sort of agroforestry elements that Will was talking about, trees are, if you like, an investment in ecological infrastructure. They've got deeper root systems. They've got an elevated canopy. They've got a long duration as a component of an agricultural system. And this means that they are, it takes time for that to be established. But once it's established, you get niche differentiation. So you get higher net primary productivity from a site. And you also can often get higher value products because of the nature of the way in which the vegetation is exploiting the environment. But that investment, there is a time lag between that investment and the return. And I think there are two ways that we can address that. One way is the sort of policy intervention way, it's a governance intervention. And that is that you recognize that you need to support farmers in that establishment phase. So you might provide seedlings in a subsidized way, you know, free or whatever. You have to be careful about that, because if you provide free seedlings, then you're disempowering and disenfranchising the production you know, of seedlings by local entrepreneurs in order to make it a sustainable element. But you could, and I think increasingly people need to move away from subsidies in terms of inputs to cash payments, which farmers can then use in whichever way they want. But you say, if you are planting so many seedlings and if they continue to survive, you know, then we will give you a payment on the basis that the establishment of those trees is valuable not only to you but also in a public context. So that context of a public support for developing this ecological infrastructure, I think and that essentially is a payment for ecosystem services. So we have a GCF project just starting in Sri Lanka, where the revenue from water from reservoirs to produce hydroelectricity, there's a levy on that electricity, which is now going to be reused to rehabilitate the highlands from where the water comes. And the critical thing is you need that water to come without sediment that reduces the reservoir capacity. So you need good land use management. And so you can get that payment for ecosystem services operating in that way. Now, the second way of sort of addressing this is to always think about sequencing. So when you're trying to promote an agroecological transition, you look at how can you put some things in which will give an immediate benefit as well as while you're establishing the longer term aspects. So, for example, I showed you in Vietnam, that exemplar landscape, and grass strips were being used because they provided an immediate high value fodder requirement because animal production was increasing in that area, while trees were being established on those contours. So if you can get that sort of sequencing right in the way in which technologies are being rolled out, then you might be able to also fill that gap in perhaps a more sustainable way than using subsidy. Sorry, I went on too long, didn't I?
No, thank you very much for these two different kind of possible measures and interventions. Unfortunately, time is always running too fast. I think we close here the public part of the interactions, and the students back in Zurich, Sabina, Keller, after, let's say, a short break of 3 minutes, the students will be happy to raise a few questions to you in the student session. And until then, I would like to thank you both very much for being with us tonight, and thanks the audience for being with us here. And we are looking forward to some very interesting other sessions on agroecology and the different principles of agroecology and how they interact, and how we all can also contribute to embrace the complexity, as Fergus mentioned, next spring. So thank you very much to two of you.